In the autumn of 1889, the earth began to move on Martha's land. It did not tremble from a quake or shift from a slide. It moved by the shovelful, one measured scoop at a time. From sunup to sundown, she worked. A lone figure against the immense, indifferent canvas of the northern plains. The prairie grass had already cured to a pale gold, and the sky held the hard, crystalline blue of coming cold. Her homestead consisted of a small, sturdy cabin and 160 acres of hope, paid for in sweat and solitude. Her husband, Thomas, had built the cabin. He had built it strong, with tight seams and a deep foundation, meant to stand against the summer sun and the spring rain. He had not lived to see it tested by a true plains winter. A sudden fever had taken him the year before, leaving Martha with the cabin, the land, 2 horses, a milk cow, and a silence that was heavier than any stone she would ever move. Now, she was digging. Not a root cellar, for one already existed beside the cabin door. Not a well, for the creek ran clear and steady 50 yards to the east. She was excavating a great, rectangular hole directly behind her home, a cavity that grew deeper and wider with each passing day. The pile of dark, rich soil beside it grew into a small hill, a monument to her relentless, solitary labor. A circuit preacher, passing through on his way to the next settlement, had stopped his horse a week prior, watching her for a long time. He saw a woman in a faded calico dress, her face smudged with dirt, her arms lean and corded with muscle. He saw the steady rhythm of her work, the blade sinking into the earth, the lift, the turn, the toss. He saw no hesitation. He had called out, asking if she required assistance. She had merely paused, wiped her brow with the back of a gloved hand, and shaken her head. He rode on, convinced the grief had finally unsettled her mind. The ground was for the dead. A barn was for the living, and it belonged above the soil, reaching for the sky, not burrowing into the dark. Alastair Finch believed in the wisdom of the surface. He was the region's most successful rancher, a man whose opinions were as solid and unyielding as the granite outcrops on his land. His own barn was a cathedral of timber, a landmark visible for miles, a testament to prosperity built the proper way. He had heard the talk in town about the widow, the woman digging her own grave, and felt a duty to intervene. He rode out to her homestead on a crisp October morning, the hooves of his fine black gelding making soft thuds on the hard-packed earth. He found her where the rumors said she would be, in the bottom of a hole that was now easily 12 feet deep and 40 feet long. The scale of the excavation startled him. This was not the work of a grieving woman lost in a daze, this was the work of a driven, focused force. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the loose soil of the mound she had created. He stood at the edge, looking down. "Mrs. Collins," he began, his voice accustomed to command, softened now with a practiced paternalism. "A word, if I may." Martha stopped her digging. She planted the shovel into the ground and looked up, her face unreadable, her eyes shadowed by the brim of her sun-worn hat. She did not speak. "This is an impressive amount of work," Finch continued, gesturing at the hole. "But it is misguided. A barn must be built above ground, with walls of thick planked timber, a steep pitched roof to shed the snow. It must be sited to block the north wind. This is how it has always been done." He paused, letting the weight of tradition settle in the air between them. "The ground freezes. The winter melt will flood this pit. The walls will collapse. You are creating a tomb for your animals, not a shelter." Martha finally pulled the shovel free and leaned it against the earthen wall. She climbed the crude ramp she had carved into one end, her movements deliberate and sure. When she stood before him, she was not frail or mad. She was grounded. "The earth has its own heat, Mr. Finch." Her voice was low, steady. "It holds a memory of the summer." Finch almost laughed. It was the kind of folklore one heard from old women and drifters. "That is a poet's fancy, not an engineer's principle. You are risking everything on a feeling." "I am risking everything if I do not," she replied, her gaze moving past him to the vast, empty horizon. He saw then that he was not speaking to a woman who could be swayed by his logic or his reputation. He was speaking to a woman who had made a different calculation, who was listening to a different kind of wisdom. "Folly," he said, more to himself than to her. It is a tragic folly. He mounted his horse, turned, and rode away, the conflict now clear. It was his proven, visible world against her unseen, unproven faith in the ground beneath her feet. The story of Martha's hole spread through the sparse settlements like a grass fire. In the general store, men leaned against the counter, whittling and talking. They called it Collins's follies, and the dirt-lined coffin they spoke of her with a mixture of pity and contempt. A woman alone was a fragile thing, they reasoned, and her grief had clearly broken her sense of what was right and proper. Building a barn was man's work, guided by established rules. Her project was an affront to that order. Her rejection of Alastair Finch's counsel sealed her reputation as a stubborn eccentric. Finch was the measure of success in their world. To ignore his advice was to invite disaster. Women in town spoke of her in hushed tones over quilting frames and while kneading dough. They worried for her soul. They saw her solitary labor as a sign that she had cut herself off not just from the community, but from God's light. They sent their husbands or sons out to her place with offers of help, but the offers were always conditional. They would help her build a proper shed, a lean-to, anything on the surface. They would not help her dig. Each offer was a test, and each time she politely refused, her isolation deepened. "I thank you for the thought," she would say, but my plan is set. Her refusal was seen not as strength, but as a symptom of her madness. She soon stopped making the long trip into town. The silent stares, the whispered conversations that ceased the moment she entered a room, became a burden she no longer wished to carry. She had enough to bear. The physical toll of the work was immense. Her days were a simple, brutal rhythm. Dig. Lift. Haul. Dump. Repeat. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and permanently stained with soil. Her back ached with a fire that only sleep could bank, never extinguish. Her only companions were her two sturdy horses, Clementine and Jasper, and her gentle Jersey cow, Daisy. They would watch her from their small corral, their presence a quiet, constant reassurance. They were the reason for the whole. They were the lives she had to protect. The community saw a woman retreating from the world, but in truth, she was burrowing deeper into it, seeking a partnership with the earth that they could not comprehend. The structure taking shape in the earth was a work of raw and practical engineering. It was a barn born of observation, not of blueprints. Martha had spent hours watching the prairie dogs, how their burrows stayed warm in the winter and cool in the summer. She had noted how the frost never went more than a few feet deep, how below that line, the earth held a constant, steady temperature. Her design followed this natural law. After digging the main pit, she had spent weeks lining the walls. She did not have the means for milled lumber, so she hauled fieldstones from the creek bed, one wheelbarrow at a time. She fit them together like a puzzle, using a mortar of clay and straw to fill the gaps, creating retaining walls that were thick and solid. For the roof, she laid heavy timbers, salvaged from a collapsed section of creek bank, across the top, leaving a narrow opening at one end for the ramp. She covered the timbers with a thick layer of sod, carefully layering the grassy bricks until they formed a living roof that would insulate and blend back into the landscape. The ramp leading down was long and gently sloped, wide enough for a horse to walk down without fear. At the top, she would build heavy, insulated doors. But the most crucial part of her design was the ventilation. She knew a sealed underground space would become foul and damp. Using a post-hole digger, she bored 2 shafts from the barn ceiling up to the surface, 10 feet away from the cabin on either side. She lined the shafts with sections of a hollowed log and capped them above ground with carefully arranged piles of rock, allowing air to circulate while keeping snow and rain out. Her final stroke of genius was the connection to her cabin. She cut a heavy trapdoor into the floor of her main room. From it, a steep but sturdy ladder led directly down into the barn. In a blizzard, she would not have to venture outside. She could care for her animals from the safety of her own home. As autumn bled into the grey stillness of November, her work grew more frantic. The days were shorter, the air sharper. The first flakes of snow dusted the ground, a stark white warning against the dark soil. She worked by lantern light long after the sun had set, her breath pluming in the cold air. She was not just building a barn. She was building an ark, The first real snows of December were heavy and wet, blanketing the prairie in a thick layer of white. It was time. Martha led her animals to the top of the ramp. The horses, Clementine and Jasper, hesitated. They snorted, their warm breath clouding in the frigid air, their eyes wide as they peered into the dark opening. The scent of raw earth and enclosed space was alien to them. Martha spoke to them in low, calm tones, her hand gentle on Clementine's neck. She walked down first, holding a lantern high. The light cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, illuminating the clean beds of straw, the neat stacks of hay, the buckets of fresh water. Slowly, cautiously, the mare followed, her hooves making soft, uncertain sounds on the packed earth ramp. Jasper followed her lead, and finally, the cow, Daisy, ambled down after them. Inside, the world changed. The wind, which had been a constant, whining presence on the surface, disappeared completely. The air was still and cool, but not biting. It was the steady, neutral cold of a cellar, a stark contrast to the piercing chill outside. The animals settled quickly, their initial apprehension melting away in the face of fresh hay and the profound quiet. They were safe from the wind. They were dry. That was all that mattered. Martha climbed the ladder to her cabin, closed the heavy trap door, and felt a profound sense of security settle over her. Her home was now a two-story dwelling, one level for her, one for her animals, both locked in an alliance against the coming winter. Miles away, Alastair Finch surveyed his own preparations. His massive barn stood proud against the grey sky, its red paint a bold slash against the snow. His men had checked every seam, stacked bales of hay against the northern wall, and ensured the livestock were deep in their stalls. He was confident. He had more than 30 head of cattle and a dozen horses, a fortune in livestock, all protected by the best barn money and tradition could build. He had done everything right. In town, the old-timers nodded sagely, their predictions growing darker. They noted the unusual thickness of the rabbit's fur, the aggressive way the squirrels had gathered nuts. It will be a winter to remember, they said to one another over mugs of hot coffee. A winter that sorts the prepared from the foolish. Their words hung in the air, an unspoken prophecy aimed directly at the lone woman on the Collins homestead. The stage was set. The great, silent arbiter of the plains, the winter itself, was about to render its verdict. The day was the 12th of January, 1890. It dawned not with light, but with a deepening of the gloom. The sky did not turn grey, it turned the colour of a leaden bruise, a sickly, oppressive slate that seemed to press down on the very earth. The temperature, which had hovered near zero for a week, began a terrifying plunge. By midday, it was 20 below, and the wind began to pick up. It was not a normal wind. It was a solid thing, a moving wall of air that carried with it a fine, stinging powder of ice. Martha felt the change from inside her cabin. The timbers of the small house began to groan, a low, constant moan under the strain. The gaps around the window frames, sealed as best she could, began to whistle a high, thin shriek. She lit her lantern, for the world outside had already vanished into a churning vortex of white. The blizzard did not arrive, it materialized, swallowing the horizon, the creek, the prairie, and finally, the cabin itself. The roar was constant, a deafening, grinding noise that vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of a world being scoured clean. Yet when she lifted the trap door, a different world was revealed. Below, in the lantern light, there was only peace. The sound of the storm was a distant, muffled rumble, like thunder far away. The air was still. Clementine and Jasper stood calmly in their stalls, munching on hay. Daisy lay curled in her bedding, placidly chewing her cud. They were entirely oblivious to the apocalypse raging just a few feet above their heads. Their survival was not a matter of endurance, but of simple, uninterrupted comfort. Martha had hung a thermometer on a post in the center of the barn. She held her lantern up to it. The mercury read 38 degrees. Not warm, but safely, miraculously, above freezing. She climbed back up to her cabin. The thermometer by her own hearth, just 10 feet from a blazing fire in the wood stove, read 50 degrees. The stove fought a losing battle against the cold that radiated from the walls and seeped through every invisible crack. Her small home was a ship in a frozen sea, creaking and straining, while the barn below was a quiet harbor, untouched by the tempest. The numbers on the two thermometers told the whole story. Her simple, radical idea was working. The storm did not relent. For 3 days and 3 nights, the world ceased to exist beyond the 4 walls of Martha's cabin. The snow, driven by the relentless, hurricane-force wind, was as fine as flour and as hard as sand. It did not just fall, it penetrated, finding its way through the smallest openings, forming fine, white dust on the interior walls. The drifts piled up with astonishing speed. By the end of the first day, the snow had reached the bottom of her windows. By the second morning, the light that filtered through was a dim, blue twilight. By the third, there was no light at all. She was entombed. The cabin groaned under a new pressure now, the immense, compacting weight of the snow on its roof. Her husband had built it well, with a steep pitch, but this was a weight he could never have anticipated. She listened to the groans of the support beams, the sharp cracks of the wood as it settled, and for the first time, a sliver of true fear pierced her resolve. What if Finch had been right about collapse? Not the walls of her barn, but the roof of her own home. She imagined it giving way, burying her in an instant avalanche of snow and splintered timber. The thought was a cold knot in her stomach. She pushed it away, focusing on routine, the only anchor in the disorienting darkness. She kept the fire stoked, ate her meager meals of dried meat and hardtack, and made her regular trips down the ladder into the calm sanctuary below. Each time she descended, the contrast was a shock. Above was the roaring, groaning, claustrophobic darkness of her siege. Below was the soft lantern light, the gentle sounds of animals chewing, the earthy smell of hay and warm bodies. It was a separate reality, a pocket of life preserved beneath the surface of a dead world. The horses would nuzzle her hand, their large, dark eyes calm and trusting. Daisy would look up from her cud, blinking slowly, entirely untroubled. They did not know they were at the heart of a legend-making storm. They only knew they were safe, and fed, and quiet. They were living proof that her folly was wisdom. While men and beasts all across the plains fought a losing battle for their lives, Martha and her small herd simply waited, sheltered in the steady, patient embrace of the earth. The silence, when it came, was more jarring than the storm. On the 4th morning, Martha awoke to a stillness so absolute it felt like a physical weight. The roaring was gone. The shrieking of the wind had ceased. The groaning of the cabin timbers had fallen quiet. There was only a profound, muffled peace. The darkness in the cabin remained total. She knew the storm was over, but the snow had buried her completely. There would be no digging out the door. She went to the window on the south side of the cabin, the one least likely to be blocked by the deepest drift. It took her an hour, using the fire shovel, to chip away the compacted ice and snow that had sealed the frame. When she finally pushed the window open, she was met with a solid wall of white. She began to dig, pushing the snow into the cabin, then shoveling it toward the wood stove to melt. It was slow, exhausting work in the cramped space. Finally, after another hour, her shovel broke through into open air. She widened the hole and wriggled through, emerging into a world made new and terrible. The landscape was gone. In its place was a rolling desert of white, sculpted by the wind into massive, undulating dunes. The sky above was a brilliant, painful blue. Her cabin was a mere mound, only the peak of its roof and the stone chimney visible. She looked for the ventilation shafts for the barn. She found them easily, 2 small, clear cones rising above the snow, melted open by the faint warmth rising from below. Air was still circulating. They were breathing. She scrambled back inside, her heart pounding with a mixture of awe and relief. She lifted the trapdoor and descended one last time into her sanctuary. She held the lantern high. Clementine and Jasper whinnied softly, their ears perked toward her. Daisy blinked in the sudden light. They were all there. All healthy. All alive. The air was fresh, the straw was clean. They had survived. Days later, as the sun began its slow work on the immense drifts, a figure appeared, stumbling across the white expanse. It was her nearest neighbor, a man named Henderson, his face skeletal with exhaustion and frostbite. He saw the chimney pipe sticking from the snow and staggered toward it. He could not comprehend how she had survived. "My barn, it's gone," he rasped, his voice raw. The roof collapsed. Lost them all. He stared at the wisp of smoke rising from her chimney, the only sign of life for miles. How are you alive?" The great thaw that followed the blizzard was as merciless as the storm itself. It revealed a landscape of utter devastation. Carcasses of cattle, frozen solid in grotesque postures, emerged from the melting drifts. The splintered remains of barns and sheds littered the plains, monuments to a battle that had been lost. The scale of the loss was staggering. Every rancher, every homesteader, had a story of desperation and failure. They had fought the storm with fire and blankets, with high walls and desperate prayers, and the storm had taken what it wanted. The news that traveled fastest was the news from the Finch ranch. Alastair Finch, the man who set the standard, had been decimated. Over half his herd was gone. His magnificent barn, the symbol of his unassailable wisdom, stood with its northern wall stove in and a section of its roof peeled back like a lid on a can. His prize bull, a creature worth more than most men's entire homesteads, had been found frozen upright in its stall. Humiliation was a heavier blow than financial loss. A week after the thaw began, Finch rode out again. This time, he did not ride his proud black gelding, but a common workhorse. He was not a patriarch coming to dispense wisdom, he was a penitent on a pilgrimage. He found Martha clearing the last of the snow from her ramp. Her animals were outside for the first time in a week, blinking in the bright sun, stretching their legs. They were not gaunt. Their coats were not matted with ice. They were perfectly, impossibly healthy. Finch dismounted and walked slowly toward the earthen structure. He looked at the sod roof, now sprouting the first hints of green. He looked at the stone-lined entrance leading into the quiet dark. He looked at Martha, her face calm, her hand steady. He did not need to ask if she had survived, he could see that she had prevailed. He stood there for a long time, the silence broken only by the sound of melting snow dripping from the eaves of her cabin. "I lost them," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual authority. So many of them. He looked at the barn, then back at her. "You listen to the ground," he said, the words a revelation to him. "We only listen to ourselves." It was the most complete surrender he could offer. Soon, others came. They came not with pity, but with a quiet, desperate curiosity. They stood at the edge of her barn, peering in, asking questions. "How deep did you dig? How did you keep the walls from caving? How did you know?" Martha answered them simply, explaining the principles of the earth's warmth, the necessity of ventilation, the logic of working with the land instead of fighting it. They stopped calling her Crazy Martha. They began to call her the woman who understood the winter. The years that followed the great blizzard of 1890 changed the face of the plains. The memory of the devastation was long and the lessons were hard-learned. Slowly, cautiously, the architecture of survival began to adapt. Homesteaders, when building their barns, began to look down instead of up. They started digging into the sides of hills, creating bank barns with one or more walls protected by the earth. Others, on the flatlands, built dugouts, structures half buried, with thick sod roofs that mimicked Martha's design. Her radical idea, born of lonely observation and grim necessity, became the new tradition. Her folly became the region's wisdom. The principles were passed from one neighbor to another, a quiet revolution of common sense spreading across the territory. They were no longer called Collins's folly, they were simply called shelters that worked. Martha lived out her days on the homestead. She never sought recognition, and she never left the land that had taught her its deepest secret. Her life remained one of quiet routine and self-sufficiency. The respect she had earned was a silent one, visible in the way people nodded to her on her rare trips to town, or in the way a rancher would stop by her property not to offer advice, but simply to watch her animals grazing peacefully near the gentle slope that led to their underground home. Her legend grew in inverse proportion to her public presence. She became a figure of frontier mythology, the solitary woman who had outsmarted the deadliest storm in living memory. As she aged, her movement slowed, but her eyes remained clear. She would sit on the small porch her husband had built, watching the seasons turn, feeling the shift of the wind. The entrance to her barn was no longer a raw cut in the earth. The grass had grown over it, softening its edges, integrating it into the landscape. It was just another small hill on the rolling prairie, indistinguishable from the others, except for the life it had protected, the legacy it had launched. She had learned that strength was not about standing tall against the storm, but about knowing when to bend, when to burrow, when to seek shelter in the embrace of something larger and older than oneself. Some structures, she knew, were built to be seen, to declare their presence to the sky. But the strongest structures were the ones built to listen, to understand, and to disappear. Her barn was not just a shelter of stone and sod. It was a philosophy made real, a quiet testament to the profound and simple truth that survival is an act of humility.